Sharon Pasula. I'm Nihiel Métis on my mother's side, and my roots are from Lac Saint Anne. I have evidence that on my dad's side I'm Jewish. So in all of that, there's lots of stories. And as you know, as we all know, Indigenous people are storytellers. And so I just want to learn more. I'm on my own journey, so I'm looking forward to learning more from you. And thank you so much for hosting this.
Welcome, Sharon, and we're glad to have you with us. You're welcome.
Thank you.
So I'd like to invite Claire to unmute and introduce yourself. Welcome. So Claire is using chat, and that's fine too. If somebody else would like to unmute themselves, that's good. If you want to introduce yourself in chat, your name, organization, and connection with digital storytelling healing, it would be good, because it's a learning circle and it's nice to get to know each other, because we'll be together for at least another 45 minutes at least. If you're more comfortable using chat or have some tech issues, you can use it too. Your name, organization, Indigenous affiliation, if any, digital storytelling and healing. So Claire is a library student at UBC, and she's really excited to be here, and she'd like to learn more.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, Sego, this is Victoria Bomberry. I'm a master's student at Western University. I'm a Mohawk from Six Nations of the Grand River, and I do research, community and academic research based around Indigenous housing and homelessness. And I'm really interested in having more of a narrative reporting style in my my reporting, so that's why I'm here. Really excited for this presentation.
Welcome.
Hello, my name is
So Charlene Wickamigad, PhD candidate, Laurental University. I'm here to learn about storytelling and working with older adults to do an adapted version of photo voice. Welcome, Charlene. Emily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, okay. Emily. Yes.
Hi,
Emily.
good morning, everybody. My name's Emily from Laurentian University. I work in Indigenous programs here. I am also interested in going back to school at some point. So really, I'm here just to learn more. And especially with COVID, I think we need to learn a little bit more about digital storytelling as opposed to being face-to-face all the time. So yeah, I'm just here to learn and curious to see what you'll have for us. So thanks for this.
Welcome. Jamie, would you like to unmute and introduce yourself, please? Jamie is originally from Natlabish, Alberta, but she's been on Shinabe Algonquin territory for more than 20 years. Katie is from Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, settler on Treaty 6, and she coordinates a lot of training opportunities and to find better ways to share knowledge about women's shelter and women seeking safety from violence. Amanda from University of Alberta her work is at the university, which includes Indigenous digital storytelling, and she'd like to learn more about how that can be part of the research process. Chelsea is Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia, MSc Nutrition student, and she's the coordinator for a two-eyed seeing camp for Mi'kmaq youth. So Jamie's dad lives in Buffalo Lake Métis settlement, and Jamie works as an educator for Indigenous programs and outreach at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. So she's joining in from Ottawa. Eleanor is from Boa Library, UBC, on unceded Musqueam territory. Nicole, she's a librarian from London, Ontario, and she's connected with two different organizations, Fanshawe College too, and she's excited to learn more about Indigenous inclusion, and she's working on an Indigenous inclusion research guide. Caroline, she's in consumer health, and she wants to learn more about digital storytelling. So I'm very pleased to welcome all of you, and you can please continue your introductions in chat, and I'd like to invite our presenter, Ms. Shelley, to introduce herself.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Manisha. I just wanted to make sure that my audio sounds good to everyone. Does it sound good? The audio is good. Okay, so I'm so excited and honored to present today for the Masquachis Micro-Learning Series. I want to thank everyone for being here today because I know our time is valuable. And yeah, I just want to make sure that I do the absolute best to serve you and all the questions that you have. So I'm always available on email if anyone needs to ask me questions. My presentation today is called The Methodology of Indigenous Digital Storytelling, a Healing Journey in Data Collection. I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Shelley Weert, and I am a member of the North Slave Métis Alliance, Yellowknife Northwest Territories. My dad, pictured on the left, is the president of the NSMA and an important role model in my life. I am 3 courses till completion of my 4-year Bachelor of Arts, Sociology and Women and Gender Studies at Athabasca University. I currently reside in Lloydminster, Alberta. I acknowledge that I reside on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I am the co-founder of an Indigenous-focused holistic health program called Women Warriors. Last summer and this summer, I was the recipient of the Alberta Indigenous Mentorship in Health Innovation undergrad summer student stipend. Last summer, I was also awarded the Haudí Seda Northwest Territory Spore Support Unit Researcher Capacity Development Grant for our Indigenous Women's Digital Health Story research. I published an academic article from this research named Decolonizing Healthcare, Indigenous Digital Storytelling as a Pedagogical Tool for Cultural Safety in Healthcare Settings. It's going to be published in Northern Public Affairs magazine. And as soon as it's published, I'll post it on my website, womenwarriors.club. I am a proud mother to 3 daughters, Kayla 11, Aubrey 9, and Harper 7. So first, I want to begin with an acknowledgement of the Alberta Indigenous Mentorship and Health Innovation mentors that have been instrumental in my success as an Indigenous student and in my health research. It is a privilege to be a mentee in this network, and I have felt respected, encouraged, and well supported from many different mentors, including Dr. Rita Henderson, Dr. Janelle Baker, Dr. Cheryl Barnaby, and Dr. Jennifer Leeson. Thank you for your leadership and for your commitment to mentoring Indigenous students. The format of this presentation will be as follows. We're going to do background about Indigenous women's health, reconciliation in healthcare, the Indigenous research agenda, story as Indigenous methodology, the Indigenous research method of digital storytelling, and then principles and ethics of Indigenous health research and how they align with digital storytelling. And finally, my research findings on the digital storytelling process. And at the end, I'm going to leave space for a 10-minute Q&A session. If I don't get to your questions, please feel free to email me. I have my email at the end of the presentation. I received ethics approval for this original research from the Athabasca University Research Ethics Board, and I was granted a Northwest Territories scientific research license from the Aurora Research Institute. You can view the 5 digital stories and my own digital story about the methodology of Indigenous digital story in health research on my website, womenwarriors.club. So I'd really encourage you to go there and watch the digital story so that you can see how they're pieced together and what exactly it looks like to do a digital story. They're 3 to 5 minute videos with a story and personal narration by the participants and accompanying music and all of their own personal photos. I just want to thank my digital storytelling co-creators, starting from the left to right, Maxine, Beatrice, Cheryl, Dorothy, and Tanya, for gifting us your stories. So first, the background on Indigenous women's health. Indigenous women's health stories are complex due to the intersecting identities of race and gender, their experience of colonialism, and social determinants of health. All of these factors can make it challenging for them to access culturally appropriate healthcare. Healthcare providers often fail to create an environment of cultural safety, defined as an outcome where Indigenous peoples feel respected and safe from racism and discrimination when they interact with the healthcare system. Moreover, healthcare providers may not understand the holistic health needs necessary to support Indigenous peoples, and the systemic racism within the healthcare system continues to contribute to health inequity and reinforces disparities. Indigenous scholar Absalon stated, "Central tendencies of Indigenous research come from the self and from understanding the self in relation to the whole. In many cases, the Indigenous searchers utilized a self-referential and experiential approach to gathering knowledge. Our medicine bundle is our own life." In relation to my own life story, the participants of Women Warriors, my former health program, influenced this research. I facilitated or trained facilitators for this program starting in 2015 and ending in 2018. It consisted of a 45-minute exercise class followed by a 10-minute nutrition component and a round circle discussion about health. I became familiar with Indigenous women's personal stories of negative experiences and racism within the healthcare system. Also, the participants expressed their desire to share positive stories and asset-based lens of their community and culture because of the negative media and stereotypes of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Their stories and my desire to enact systems change within the healthcare system motivated me to return to university and embark on this journey as an Indigenous health researcher. As well, I have witnessed the impacts of health inequity and the disproportionate burden of disease and poor health outcomes within my own family, including type 2 diabetes, cancer, and mental illness. From May to June 2019, I co-created 2 digital stories with Indigenous women from Lloydminster and Onion Lake Cree Nation. So that was Beatrice, pictured on the left, and Maxine. I relocated to Yellowknife for the months of July and August and co-created 3 digital stories with Indigenous women there. And that was Cheryl, Tanya, and Dorothy. I conceived of this project as community-based participatory action research carried out through the lens of Indigenous feminism. Indigenous feminism is the theoretical lens that I work through as an Indigenous female researcher. This lens centers the participants' voices as the person most knowledgeable about her own experiences. As such, I did not form hypothetical questions about their lived experiences, as I did not position myself as the expert. Academic Green states, Indigenous feminism is a theoretical engagement with history and politics, as well as practical engagement with contemporary social, economic, cultural, and political issues. It is an ideological framework not only of intellectuals, but also of activists. Indigenous feminism interrogates power structures and practice between and among Indigenous peoples and dominant institutes. It leads to praxis, theoretically informed, politically self-conscious activism. Indigenous feminism seeks to provide an analysis of Indigenous women's particular experiences of oppression. And if you had the time to watch the 5 digital stories, you will be privy to the co-creators' own self-location within colonial systems and their own forms of praxis. they shared the intergenerational impacts of colonization and residential schools and how they navigated colonial systems in order to protect themselves or their children. They also provide calls to action for medical professionals on how to provide more culturally safe care for Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation in healthcare aims to close the gaps in health outcomes that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and support Indigenous peoples as they heal from colonization, the legacy of residential school, and the ongoing systemic racism embedded in our institutions. Indigenous women's knowledge is integral to sustaining traditional knowledge systems and healing practices, and to decolonizing knowledge production. My model for Indigenous research is Smith's The Indigenous Research Agenda. Smith states the chart uses the metaphor of the ocean tides. The tides represent movement, change, process, life, inward and outward flow of ideas, reflections, and actions. The four directions, decolonization, healing, transformation, and mobilization, represent processes. They are not goals or ends in themselves. They are processes that can be incorporated into practices and methodologies. The agenda is focused strategically on the goal of self-determination of Indigenous peoples. Self-determination is more than a political goal. It is the goal of social justice, which is expressed through and across a wide range of psychological, social, cultural, and economic terrains. The following 4 slides, I will share quotes from the digital storyteller co-creator interviews to highlight their experiences with the 4 directions during this research process. Healing intergenerational trauma. And then the more I talked, the more I became stronger. And I think that's what helped me heal when I spoke about it to the audience. So it really helped. That was something I had to try and seek or find within myself, just so that I can help myself and then help my family. Talking about it was really an ice-breaking thing for me. Decolonization. And then at the end of the project, I showed my grandmother, and she was so proud and tears in her eyes, and I was like, wow. So I was grateful at the end of the video to be a part of this process. My grandma, she said that because I was young and to practice the culture and, you know, taking part in it, just like participating in it. Transformation. I kind of like the recording part, and I also like finding the music for the background. I enjoyed that, and I felt proud that I made choices in creating the digital story with Shelley's help. So I felt like I can do anything. Mobilization. I guess the most powerful moment was after we shared our stories and people came up and really thanked us for what we did. Then also just being able to have interviews and be able to give a little bit of the background of our stories. Story as Indigenous methodology. Kovacs states that story evokes the holistic quality of Indigenous methodologies, and there exists interrelatedness between storying and knowing. Kovacs states stories are vessels for passing along teachings, medicines, and practices that can assist members of the collective. They promote social cohesion by entertaining and fostering good feelings. Indigenous educator Joanne Archibald coined the term Indigenous story work and describes the principles and protocols that are integral to Indigenous digital storytelling as a pedagogical practice. Respect, responsibility, reciprocity, reverence, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. Storytelling is important in Indigenous culture because it is how we teach and learn. Storytellers share their own life experiences with humility as a way of provoking critical reflection in others while continuing to learn themselves. Indigenous digital storytelling within the framework of Indigenous research methodology allows Indigenous women to share their health stories in a safe and respectful context. This decolonizing methodology allows for self-representation that challenges stereotypes and allows Indigenous communities to prioritize their own social and community needs and to protect their identities and cultural values in the process. It is essential to the decolonization process that Indigenous people speak with our own voices about our histories, culture, and experiences. My ethics were guided by the 4 R's of Indigenous research: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. I practice relational accountability and mindful reciprocity with all my co-creators by putting our relationship above all else in this research process. The phrase "nothing about us without us" rings in my ears at all times. I inform them every time I present our digital stories, and I ask if they would like to attend. I respect their ability to speak for themselves. So the relationship building process and trust between my digital storytelling participants and I were central to this project. I had previous relationships with the women in Lloydminster and Onion Lake Cree Nation because they had participated in Women Warriors. Due to the fact that we had a good level of rapport, they felt comfortable exploring the legacy of residential school in their lives and how it impacted their health. There are several ways that I created a safe environment for these women to share their health stories. First, I was clear they had total control over every aspect of their stories. They chose every detail of their digital story, including writing the first-person narration, picking out their personal photos, and the music that accompanied them. My role was to hold space for their stories, which meant listening with non-judgment and offering support for however they asked for it. For example, Maxine asked me to go with her to the site of the residential school that her mother attended, St. Barnabas. She stated, "Shelley and I, we went to go visit the site, so that was powerful. Just taking the pictures and stuff like that, actually visiting the site, that was quite powerful for me, and honoring their memories. So bringing that into the digital story was really good for me." Barasa and colleagues stated, "A directive of Indigenous research methodologies is not to collect knowledge just for the sake of collecting knowledge, but to apply this knowledge in a good way. By achieving full engagement of Indigenous communities in research, community is left with an asset, something they can build on. Any research undertaken should aim to prioritize capacity building and practices that will enhance self-determination. I demonstrated that I valued these women's time, knowledge, and emotional labor by paying living wages while we worked on their stories, which took approximately 1 week. I gave them a USB of their digital story so that they can show it to whomever they wanted. One of the digital storytelling participants showed her story at several schools for Orange Shirt Day. She stated that bringing her story to her home community and the schools had a great impact. She states, "Because the young kids were being educated, like the younger generation was being educated about the residential school system. And like I shared some of the pictures of the sites and how it looked before and how it looks now. So it brought it to life to see this actually did happen, and it was a difficult time in history for our people." In the past, the narrative surrounding Indigenous people's health has been from a deficit lens that has encouraged harmful discourses of pathology and stigma surrounding Indigenous peoples. Hyatt and colleagues defined a deficit discourse as a mode of thinking that frames and represents Aboriginal identity in a narrative of negativity, deficiency, and disempowerment. These stereotypes of deficiency have exacerbated rather than addressed persistent health disparities and continue to harm Indigenous peoples. The methodology of Indigenous digital storytelling is an important tool for Indigenous people to combat deficit narratives and assert their own self-determined knowledge. It allows for authentic partnership with Indigenous peoples and to create strength-based narratives about existing capacities in Indigenous communities to address their own health issues. Digital storytelling process. So the second half of this presentation is about the research that I did this summer, which was the interviews with the digital storytelling participants about the process of digital storytelling. So I coded all the transcripts and I'm currently just writing my paper on it. So this is all the data from that. Motivation to participate. A co-creator stated that her motivation to be a part of this research was, it was kind of like a healing journey for myself. Tell my story just so that everybody will know what goes on in our lives, what us First Nation women have to go through. The storyteller's motivation to participate and share story is as follows. Sharing strength-based stories to benefit and encourage others. Sharing strength-based stories and resiliency. Advocating for Indigenous women. Praxis about the impacts of colonization as a social determinant of health. For example, colonization as the driving force for Indigenous women's high-risk lifestyles and marginalization. Sharing stories with healthcare professionals to educate and advocate for First Nations Métis Inuit health. Creating opportunities for communication between healthcare professionals and First Nations Métis Inuit peoples. Our Indigenous Knowledge Translation event, Legacy, Indigenous Women's Health Stories, took place on August 15, 2019 in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. Prior to the event, we collectively discussed what type of questions the panel felt comfortable answering and decided not to open the floor for questions and answers. I explained to the audience that it was my responsibility as the lead principal investigator of this research to keep my participants safe from colonial violence during their time with me. I explained that a seemingly innocent question might be perceived as impolite, cruel, or violent. As well, there are very few spaces for Indigenous women-only voices, and decolonizing this space means Indigenous women's voices take precedence over everyone else's voices. This community event was about creating a safe space where Indigenous women felt empowered to advocate for themselves and safe enough to be vulnerable as they shared their health stories. A digital storytelling participant stated about the event, I kind of had stage fright at first, but then I had to overcome that because I needed to tell them my story. I had the courage to tell my story in a way that I felt comfortable in saying it. It's the authentic story. Digital storytelling process, the role of the facilitator. A storyteller stated, I think what made it more comfortable is because Shelley facilitated the fitness program for First Nation and Métis, and she was welcoming, so that kind of made me feel more comfortable. The co-creator stated that the digital storytelling facilitator should display the following qualities. It was easier that we had a pre-existing relationship already, that I had an Indigenous perspective. I created a welcoming environment. I had good interpersonal skills, communication skills, and empathetic listening. A safe space. So a safe space, usually I went into their home and we co-created the digital stories there. And that I was able to bring reflection and clarity to our conversations. The co-creator stated that the digital storytelling process was a powerful tool because it included the following: emotional connection with the content and also with the audience. It allowed them to tell their stories in their authentic voice. It's bringing back the values of traditional knowledge and applying them in a contemporary way. The digital stories are bridging the communication gap between Indigenous peoples and healthcare providers. It acted as a form of empowerment for them and also a tool of healing. So I just wanted to share about this slide. We did a lot of time out on the land, especially in Onion Lake Cree Nation, and obviously with Maxine when we visited the residential school site. So the top picture is a field at Onion Lake Cree Nation that we visited. And then the middle is Maxine at the residential school site, and below is the Great Slave Lake in Yellowknife. It was important that the digital storytelling co-creators and I shared time on their land together because it created a mutual understanding of their epistemology. A co-creator stated, when you're in the environment, then you can feel comfortable. And then, you know, it's kind of like if you're in an office setting and you're trying to explain the area, but they don't really get the understanding. When Shelley came over, she understood the stories I told her. And you know, nothing would have come up if she didn't come over and I didn't give her a tour. We had a connection with the land and the area. The original intention of this digital storytelling research was to learn about Indigenous women's traditional knowledge and healing practices, and to help them conceptualize and communicate about their own health stories and service needs. In my ethics application, I did not mention residential schools or exploring the legacy of residential schools. Yet every one of my co-creators wanted to talk about how residential school had impacted their families. Through this process, I learned that Indigenous women are still healing from the legacy of residential schools, and we need more safe spaces to talk about it. Also, we need more tools to heal from the intergenerational trauma passed on by residential schools. The digital storytelling process became the healing tool and the method of praxis. A co-creator stated about her process of digital storytelling and healing from the legacy of residential schools. I definitely have more of an understanding of the impacts of residential school. It was mostly for us the emotional part of our journey, because for myself, I'm still not that touchy-feely, huggy person or anything like that. But now I understand the loss of affection there. Like, it's difficult for me. Like for me and my children to show affection, but I do show it with my grandchildren now. So it's a little bit different. 3 recommendations for healthcare providers as provided by the digital storytelling co-creators. Number 1, respect and validate Indigenous traditional beliefs, knowledge, and healing practices. A co-creator stated, there's a lot of disbelief and even a bit of mockery behind the importance of traditional knowledge. View health as holistic and interconnected. A co-creator stated, going in with an open mind and non-judgmental attitude will help them look at the whole picture of a human instead of looking at the human physiology as very compartmentalized and separate. Number 3, building respectful relationships. A co-creator stated, I think to be more understanding of First Nations and to show more respect and, you know, to explain what they're going to be doing. Building respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples requires medical professionals to practice culturally safe care. Barasa and colleagues state that a person is considered to encompass culturally safe practices if they are able to maintain a trusting and reciprocal working relationship with someone from another culture. The digital storytelling co-creators requested that medical professionals become more proficient at understanding Indigenous peoples, including cultural mannerisms and body language, to have a non-judgmental attitude towards Indigenous peoples, and to quit stereotyping Indigenous peoples. So throughout this process, I've come up with my own recommendations. If you are going to use the methodology of Indigenous digital storytelling, I found some gaps in the system. And so these are my top 3 recommendations. So number 1, to create a free website with culturally appropriate stock photos. Stock photo websites are full of imagery that is violent, including racial stereotypes, cultural misappropriation, and pan-Indigenous photos. For Indigenous peoples that may be missing personal photos due to being removed from their culture and or community, either through the 60 scoop or foster care, it is another act of colonial violence to attempt to use stock photo databases that are not culturally appropriate. I recommend me, we, you, whoever, someone, us, start a free online journal stock photo website by and for Indigenous peoples that represents the beauty and cultural diversity of Indigenous peoples. Number 2, I cannot stress enough the importance of relationships in this research process. This methodology is relational and it takes time, meaning prepare to spend time at people's kitchen tables listening with an open heart. People need time to build the trust necessary to gift you their stories. You must allow your co-creator to lead and continually reinforce their decisions as the right decisions. Using the phrase, "Does it feel good to you?" or how does your spirit feel?" can help them clarify their decision without influencing them. It will take more time than you plan to do a story. So just for an example of how much time it takes to do one digital story, it usually took me, well, some of them took longer than others because, you know, we went off and visited different sites, or we spent, you know, 2 days relationship building. But usually it takes at least 12 hours to do a digital story. And so that doesn't include all the relationship building that you're doing beforehand. And on my own digital story, you can see the actual process that I went through with each one of them, which was different. So some of them wanted to do their digital story orally, where I wrote it down for them, and some of them wanted to write it down themselves. So it all depended on what they wanted to do. And then number 3, reciprocity on behalf of researchers should be to subtitle all digital stories in the traditional language of the participants so that we can contribute to cultural resurgence and revitalizations in the communities that we are co-creating with. I did not have enough time last summer to subtitle Dorothy's story in Tlicho, which is, I regret it, but I didn't have enough time, I didn't have a translator, and I wasn't prepared to do it. So if I am fortunate enough to do another digital storytelling research project, I will incorporate it into my research plan and budget for a translator. Okay, so I'm so excited to now open the floor for about a 10-minute question and answer. I'm looking forward to sharing any information that may help you on your digital storytelling research journey. If we run out of time, please feel free to contact me through email, Shelley@womenwarriors.club. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us. And I told Manisha that at the beginning of this presentation, I do have 2 Google Docs that I will share with her with the references from this presentation, and also digital storytelling resources such as stock photo websites, where to get music, some really interesting digital storytelling, previous projects by Alberta Health Services, just some links to some resources. So yeah, thank you so much. Now I'm excited to hear what your questions are and how I can help you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I really liked how you said, you know, no questions after the sharing, to really make sure that it was a safe space. And there are a lot of questions that seem really innocent from that person's perspective, and it goes down a rabbit hole, right? So I'm just curious, was there any feedback about that? Did people appreciate that? Obviously the participants would, but how did the audience react to that?
Well, so it was an Indigenous knowledge translation event where I did have a feedback system for the audience members to contribute their voice. They weren't allowed to do a Q&A, but I had an I wish tree. And so you can see it in the photo right here. I gave everyone a leaf, and then I said, I would like for you to complete this sentence. I wish that healthcare providers ... And so then I actually used that as data collection, and all of those responses on the I Wish tree are part of my academic paper that's coming out with Northern Public Affairs magazine. So they did have the ability to provide some feedback, and I think that probably quelled anyone's issues in the audience with not being able to have Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really brilliant. I think that's a great way to do it. So thanks.
Thank you.
So Karen has a question. What and how are the recommended ways to educate clinicians, as well as others working in the healthcare field who aren't clinicians, so they can provide culturally appropriate care and services? That's been my challenge. Thank you.
So that's a huge question. And So the issue with cultural safety is the implementation of it is challenging. And so what I was trying to do with these digital stories was to bring them to medical professionals to create empathy between the digital storytellers and then the medical professionals. And so I did present it to several medical professionals. I'll just give you some examples of where I presented these digital stories. And again, this is all in my academic paper, which I'm not allowed to share until it's published. But one place that I presented these digital stories was at Stanton Territorial Hospital in Yellowknife. And we had 2 days for any healthcare providers that worked in that establishment to come down and watch the digital stories. And then I had them fill out a form talking about what they learned. And then the second place that I presented these stories was to medical residents with the University of Calgary. Last September, I was invited to present. There was only maybe like 10 residents, but again, I took that as data and I looked at their responses, and a lot of them didn't even know what intergenerational trauma was. Some of them were really informed and then some of them weren't. So there was just like this wide response between some of them. And then the third place I presented these digital stories was at the Government of the Northwest Territories Cultural Competency Training, Cultural Safety Training last November. And again, in my current research paper, I'm going to be talking about what their responses were. And so, you know, this is a way for me to be able to teach healthcare providers about Indigenous women's health without them directly having to advocate for themselves. And I would love to do more digital stories with Indigenous communities that want to talk about their own healthcare needs. But I can't really answer that question 100% because it's something that is just, it's huge, and it's a huge field, cultural safety right now, and the implementation of it is very challenging. So I definitely have, I have a lot of literature on it if you would like that literature.
Diana has a question. Digital stories are incredibly important sources of information. Any recommendations on how to utilize these types of mediums to influence government funders, even for cabinet submissions?
Yeah, so, you know, in England, Pip Harding, she's a digital storytelling researcher, and all of her digital stories are about health. And, you know, there's been uptake within the healthcare system where they present the digital stories at like policy meetings with healthcare professionals, and then they discuss it and see how they could, you know, potentially impact policy with it. So, again, you know, I just started this project last year, and I'm still finishing up my undergrad, but you could potentially use digital storytelling to influence policy. There's no reason why you couldn't take it to hospital administration or your local PCN or wherever you feel like there's a need, and show them to the people in positions of influence so that they have a better understanding and they could influence policy.
BT Sidora, she has a question. Great presentation. And she's a researcher with Mature Women's Health at the University of Alberta. And she was wondering whether you think that stories would change over time. In other words, if you would take the stories of the same woman in 5 or 10 years again, do you think you would get the same story with the same impact? Personal stories are known to change with increased experience and change in worldview.
I mean, well, wouldn't I love to have funding for a longitudinal study about that? Wouldn't that be amazing? I don't know. I'm not really sure if it would change or not change, but I can tell you like what's happened with some of the digital storytelling participants. It's been 1 year since we've done the project. And I just want to give you a few examples of the way that they use their digital stories and the impact that it's had. And maybe it has changed their worldview already. So one of the digital storytelling participants was able to advocate for herself with her own doctor in the room, her own GP in the room at one of the events that we had. And she said that her relationship changed with her general practitioner after she got to advocate for herself and share her traditional knowledge and her beliefs. And then another one of the participants, she's actually securing housing, having been a part of this project. And I wrote her a letter of reference, and she used her digital storytelling project to apply for Habitat for Humanity. And so of course that's a social determinant of health, securing housing, right? So I would think that has impacted her story already. So these are just a few of the examples.
Ada would like to know, thank you so much for this presentation, Shell. This is amazing work and so many beautiful smiles in the photos. Also great recommendations for the Indigenous stock images. During your research, did you come across any information or barriers specific with Indigenous women living with disabilities?
No, I've never seen any digital stories about that. There's on YouTube, there are digital stories. They're called Indigi stories. And they have some really wonderful Indigenous digital stories, but I've never seen any digital stories about Indigenous people with disabilities. I haven't seen any.
Sharon Priscilla would like to know, how do you coach participants to share their story?
Well, I don't really think it's coaching. I think it's just relationship building and trust, and maybe that is a form of coaching, but there was a lot of fear surrounding. It was quite an emotional journey with them deciding, you know, what are we going to talk about? What's safe for them to talk about? There was a lot of fear about being public. There was all different kinds of emotions. But at the end of the day, the fact that they had total control over the digital story and they didn't have to share anything that they didn't want to. And also I gave them the option to walk away at any point during the research process. You know, they didn't owe me anything. If they didn't want to participate in this project, they didn't have to. And I feel like that gave them a real sense of security so that they could overcome some of their fears. And so I think, you know, it's all about relationship building, building that trust, making sure that they know that they have all the control. And then also just a lot of encouragement, like your story is important, it needs to be told. And also the relationship between each other too was important, you know, like group support is really important when we're doing things like this. So making sure that there was like some cohesion within the group. And so we went out for supper, out for lunch one time, and dinner one time. So yeah, those were some of the ways that I made sure that they felt secure and safe and that we formed those relationships.
Eleanor would like to know, we are helping nursing and pharmacy professors develop course content on Indigenous health, and finding good research is hard. What are your recommendations?
I would have to get back to you on that. Nursing and pharmacy profs develop course content on Indigenous health, and finding good research is hard. Like, so I mean, I can send you all my references, and there's so many resources on cultural safety right now. So if you start to, yeah, just Google cultural safety and programs that have cultural safety in them. But again, one of the reasons I did these digital stories is so that Indigenous women could advocate for themselves. Instead of it coming from the top down, it's the bottom up. And so I feel like, yeah, that is hard to find resources like that, where it's Indigenous people's voices telling healthcare providers what we need, as opposed to, you know, top-down research. Anyway, so I'm just going to email her my references and send her some links to resources after this is done.
And I was just going to say thank you for this presentation, because it does fill a gap. It's the sort of information that is very helpful to pass on to people.
Oh, thank you so much, Eleanor.
You're welcome.
So Jenny Moore says, The Truth About Stories by Thomas King. Yes, stories change, but every time it's told with information needed to hear at that moment. That's from her experience. This is her comment. Would you like to say something on this, Shelley?
I mean, you know, Thomas King has this amazing quote, like, you know, that the only thing we are is stories. And so within coding my own transcripts and working with these women, you know, they really loved this methodology and being able to tell stories. I mean, fundamentally, that's who we are as people. And so I think that's why there was such good uptake and why they really enjoyed being a part of the project, because, you know, they could relate to storytelling.
So there are a couple of other links posted in the chat, and the links would be emailed to everyone too. Funding, Shelley. How did you get funding for your project? And you mentioned you did pay your compensate your you know, the people who told you stories, their living wages. So
Yeah.
Was it funded by someone?
Yeah, so I had told you my funders at the beginning of the presentation. So it was the Alberta Indigenous Mentorship and Health Innovation Undergrad Summer Student Stipend, and also the Hody Seda Researcher Capacity Development Grant. So those were my two funders. And then again, I'm still an undergrad. I'm just completing my degree, and I haven't searched for any more funding because I don't have time right now to do more research, but I'm sure there's, you know, now that it's COVID and that we have to do research that's culturally appropriate and not go into community and jeopardize people's health, I think that there would be a lot of funding right now for digital storytelling.